So good evening. My name is Matthew Gillican. I'm one of the co-chairs of Livable Seville. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Livable Seville's vision is to create a livable, thriving Charlottesville for everyone. We advocate for policies to build an inclusive Charlottesville area with affordable housing, sustainable transportation, and healthy neighborhoods welcoming to all. And one of our values is that we believe housing is a human right, and this is a major driving force for a lot of our actions around the Seville plans process. So the Seville plans process has been going on in some sense since 2017. It kind of reformalized in 2020. And in 2021, early that year, the city approved an affordable housing plan, and later in 2021 approved the comprehensive plan. And now we are in the final stretch of rewriting the zoning code, as the city's released 2 out of 3 parts of the zoning code. And the city is still taking feedback on that. We're going to give you some opportunities to provide feedback that we think will help the city accomplish its equity and environment goals. And tonight's a really cool opportunity to talk about what has just been consistently one of the hot button topics in Charlottesville, which could be called a few different things: missing middle housing or medium intensity housing. But we're talking about everything ranging basically from a duplex to small, maybe even slightly bigger than small apartment buildings. It's a type of housing that historically was allowed throughout most of Charlottesville, and now is not allowed in most of Charlottesville. And so we want to talk about Charlottesville ultimately, but we're going to take a little trip up to Arlington with our friend Bryan Coleman from the NAACP Arlington Branch to talk about what's been going on up there. Arlington has also been going through a process of addressing its affordability issues, and there's many pieces to that, but zoning is a big one, and missing middle housing is a big one. And they fairly recently passed a new zoning code that this was the center question. There were hundreds and hundreds of people that showed up at public comment. They had to extend it out over a couple of days to make it all happen. Hoping we don't have quite that long of public meetings in Charlottesville, but I expect there will be a lot of opinions when this comes before Planning Commission and City Council. So Bryan Coleman is going to present to us, and then we're going to have a time of question and answer. Throughout the event, you'll be able to put things in the chat that will come to myself or Bryan or Sunshine. I'll be moderating questions, and then at the end, we're going to have a time of Q&A. Sunshine Mathon from PHA is going to hop on to help provide more local context. So Bryan Coleman, just a little bit about Bryan and Sunshine. Bryan Coleman is the second vice president of the NAACP Arlington Branch and the chair of its housing committee. He obtained a master's degree from the University of California, San Diego in international affairs, and works as a program analyst for GovCIO, an IT consulting firm which services the Department of Veterans Affairs. He's also involved with the Arlington Democratic Party and serves on the Arlington County Transportation Commission and the Arlington Chamber of Commerce. Sunshine Mathon is the executive director of Piedmont Housing Alliance in Charlottesville. He has a master's in architecture from the University of Texas at Austin and a BS in physics from Bates College in Maine. Committed to supporting deeply equitable and sustainable affordable communities, he has led the development of over 1,200 healthy, efficient homes in Texas and Virginia. As a nationally recognized leader at the intersection of climate resilience and equitable affordable housing development, Sunshine has consulted with a wide variety of local and national housing intermediaries. So Bryan, I'm going to hand it over to you, and he's going to present, and then we will shift into Q&A. Thank you very much.
So thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. And thank you for the very generous introduction. So as was introduced earlier, yes, Arlington did recently pass our version of the missing middle housing proposal. Just this past month, actually, in which we were able to, after 8 years, finally able to turn over nearly 100 years of restrictive zoning practices. Our missing middle study began in 2015, along with our master plan for Arlington County, but the process really began to pick up in late 2020, and we saw higher intensity in both the pro and con side of the policy starting around late 2022. So with that, I'll begin with the first slide here. So what is missing middle? In Arlington's context, missing middle is a form of housing which stands in between detached single-family homes and mid-high-rise apartments. So something I think is important to note is a misconception that comes out with the name missing middle, which is why later on in the process, there was a shift in the language from missing middle to expanded housing options, because a lot of people believe that what was middle about missing middle referred to middle income, and that's not directly correct, or rather that's not strictly correct. So what's missing first is the types of housing. In fact, a small share of Arlington homes are classified in the range identified here between duplex and side-by-side stacks to live work, as some examples. This also would extend to quadplexes, sixplexes, eightplexes, and in fact, due to an ordinance passed in 1938, which rendered those forms of housing illegal in the majority of the land, only 79% of that housing is actually zoned for single-family home usage. So relatively speaking, there's a very small amount of land in Arlington prior to this decision in March that you could build missing middle homes on. The middle part of this refers to the types of homes, of course, given that you're able to now build a larger variety of homes between the single-family detached homes as well as your high-rise apartments. So what does missing middle look like? Well, here are a few examples in Lion Park, Cherrydale, Aurora Highlands, East Falls Church, Penrose, which is near where I live. And you get an example of duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, even an eightplex in Penrose, which I think goes to address another consideration that many people have, which is, well, these homes aren't going to fit in with the character of the neighborhoods. And in fact, as you can see, many homes are quite beautiful and they fit right in line with the rest of the homes there. In fact, as you can see in the townhouse example in East Falls Church, they fit in exactly similar to those homes around it. Triplexes, duplexes, eightplexes even, stacked towers, they all accommodate to the profile and character of the town in which they are built. And so there is, in my opinion, no risk of any sort of blight coming up in terms of the construction profile. And I think an important question then moving on is, well, why is it missing? Well, 79%, as I said earlier, of Arlington's residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family home usage. As you can see in this map here, which outlines what was a red line map of Arlington, Virginia, county laws passed specifically 1938 and later on in 1941, if I'm not mistaken, divided lands into 4 zones. Most residential land was zoned specifically for single-family housing usage only, meaning that no multifamily homes were allowed on that land. And those zoning practices had a segregative effect on our neighborhoods in Arlington. You'll see another map later on in the demonstration that illustrates how correlated those areas which were zoned exclusively for single-family usage tended to be more affluent and generally whiter than the rest of the county, limiting not only by income, but by social standing, those who were of color in those neighborhoods and preventing them from matriculating into areas which typically had better schools and more access to different resources. Moving on. This is one example of the segregation that occurred in Arlington. For those who don't know, there is a an area called Halls Hill, which is a traditionally Black neighborhood in Arlington. And in Halls Hill, there's a place called Halls Hill Wall. And Halls Hill Wall was a literal wall built in the 1940s that segregated the primarily white neighborhood of Woodlawn and Waverly, Woodlawn, Waverly, Barcroft from Halls Hill. So this blue line represents the wall, which stood as a physical edifice that prevented cars from driving through, therefore entering into a primarily white neighborhood. I believe in 1965, Halls Hill Wall was dismantled in part, not fully, that would not be done until the 80s, but in part, to allow certain areas for people to walk through. But unfortunately, that was not done out of any sense of magnanimity. That was done specifically to allow Black help to come into white neighborhoods to work for those households, but not to allow Black students or Black families to live in those segregated neighborhoods. Moving on. This is the map I was referring to earlier, which demonstrates how closely overlapped we see our single-family detached permitted areas and those communities that are primarily white and typically more affluent in Arlington. There is an incredible amount of similarity here. So as you can see, these areas which have this checkered mark pattern overlapped with the areas that are primarily single-family zoned exclusively are virtually one-to-one. And so what you have then is North Arlington and Northeast Arlington, along with a significant amount of Northwest Arlington, being primarily white with incomes averaging in the upper percentiles, whereas South Arlington, with a few exceptions, tend to be middle, lower income, and traditionally you have people of color live in quite a few communities. For reference, I live in Central Arlington, just beneath where you see this large dividing line between North and South. And so in addition to the general issues around segregation in our communities, you see a home ownership issue, which is a countrywide problem. And one of the issues that is critical to solving this larger problem is frankly that of supply. And as you can see, from 2010 to 2019, we have graphed out our average apartment rent along with the detached house average price and a condominium average price. And there is a significant uptick consistently over this period for approximately 10 years. And this is not simply due to the cost of land. Right? This is also due simply to scarcity. And I think this is something that stands apart from nearly any other commodity we see, is that there is a consistently fixed amount of this vital commodity. As I said earlier, housing is a human right. And unfortunately, we are depriving many of being able to access that by a sheer issue of scarcity. So what should we do about it? As we can see, these areas within Arlington, which are primarily blue, represent how many people can actually live within Arlington based upon their median income. This refers to the affordable to median income areas, and the majority of Arlington is affordable to white families. Unfortunately, as you see, declining levels of affordability begin to trickle out as you get to your Black and Hispanic families, meaning that the majority of communities within Arlington are not affordable to people who are either Black or Latino. And it's no surprise that even for white families, the very tippy top of Arlington, which has traditionally been the most segregated areas of Arlington, are the most expensive. And even most white families can't afford to live in the very top part of Arlington. whereas South Arlington is more accessible generally to Asian and Hispanic families. And unfortunately, Black families have it the worst, where the majority of Arlington is not affordable. This also represents, I think, quite clearly the amount of land used, which ties directly into our considerations about environmental care and environmental justice, because you see single detached homes use almost 3/4 of the land, yet the distribution of units is only about 24%. So what does that mean? It means that the majority of the land is being used for something that only requires 24% of it. This is an extremely inefficient use of land. And there's incredible dearth of housing options in between your mid and high rise multifamily units and your single detached units. And something I think is important to note is that there's a great amount of efficiency on the right side of this, this chart here. As you can see that the mid and high rise multifamily units, while they only use a little bit less than 9% of the land, there's an amazing amount of distribution of the units. They're spread throughout the county and are particularly efficient at using the land, whereas single family detached houses are the complete inverse. So here we see that Missing Middle is an attempt to address the issues of both affordability as well as racial injustice in Arlington County, whereas Missing Middle, which used to be legal up until 1938, would be re-legalized. And this graph here demonstrates all the areas in which the Affordable Housing Development Plan would be in effect. Effectively, the majority of Arlington, which has been zoned exclusively for single family home usage. Why it's been proposed is to address two things. First, our issue with housing supply. So by that increasing that supply, we can both have that high demand for homes addressed and put a downward pressure on prices by increasing our supply, as well as divvying up land costs amongst several units, meaning that each unit is therefore more affordable to a family, particularly our working class families. And also by increasing our variety of homes, we not only address people in different stages of life who may not want to live in a large 4-story apartment, or may simply want to live with family using an ADU, in which both their children or other family members are able to, say, have a family and live in a duplex or a triplex with an ADU for elderly parents, or even children returning from college or grad school. These smaller homes, in fact, are more attainable to those families, and they offer more alternatives to McMansions, which last time I checked, I believe sat at around $1.25 million on average in price. So we have a crossroads. We can either maintain the status quo, which leads to an influx of by-right supersized homes that are unaffordable to most Arlingtonians, or we can allow gentle density to support the future of Arlingtonians residents and provide an alternative to the unfortunate spiral we have currently existing within the country, such that middle income and upper to middle income residents are squeezed at the top and preventing the more affordable options for middle and lower income families to achieve, because those homes are being taken by those who can't possibly afford more without jeopardizing other necessities like food or paying for a child's education. So I think this graph is really important because it demonstrates the expected cost, but also the price range for those able to afford missing middle homes. So here we see at our larger end, say, let's take the side-by-side duplex. Stands about $1.1 to $1.4 million in cost. It's 3 to 4 bedrooms, and you would have to have an average income $244,000 as a household, so family income, so 2 people, not just one. But as you go down, you see this increase in affordability, especially at the 6 to 8plex range, where you have 1 to 2 bedrooms. It would be about $2,700 to $3,300 a month to rent, but it would also be $5,200 to $6,700 in sales price, and the income you would need is about $108,000 to $118,000. For reference, here the average area median income for a family is $128,000 for a family, meaning that these homes at 6 to 8plex range are broadly affordable to those in Arlington. This, of course, will change depending upon the environment, understanding that costs are much higher in Arlington than they are in Charlottesville, relatively speaking. But you see that the logic still holds, that the more units, the more affordable. Something I think is also really important to mention here is that by creating a variety of housing options by which people of various income levels can access housing, you get a virtuous cycle. I like to refer to it as a sort of ladder, where by putting up a rung at the higher end, let's say that this rung is the single family home, which is broadly considered to be unachievable to most. But let's assume that this is your end goal, where you want to go at the end of your journey. You need rungs on this ladder to reach that end goal. It's highly unlikely someone will be able to make a large single family home their starter home. So what do you need? You need to have these alternatives. You need to have the 4plex, you need to have the 6plex, you need to have the townhouse. You need things that allow people at the middle and upper middle income range to be able to access, such that eventually they can move up, if they so choose, to the large single family home. Something I think that's important to recognize, which addresses and often put questions, well, what does this do to help middle and lower income folks? Well, by creating these options higher up in the economic spectrum that aren't as expensive as single family homes, those who are able to access the townhouse or the side-by-side duplex or the quad or the 6plex will move up into the more expensive options, therefore freeing up the least expensive options within the market. So if I was staying at a apartment that rented, let's say, $1,800, well, my family and I can now move into a 6plex. Say we choose to move into a 6plex. That opens up that $1,800 apartment for someone else who may not have our means to say, oh, I can access that. And we all begin to move up this ladder. But without establishing these rungs, we're all stuck in a suboptimal world, which ultimately leads to the sort of stagnation that we see around the country surrounding housing. And so here,
Bryan, I just want to hop in real quick. That last slide is a great slide. And I'll mention too that in Charlottesville's affordable housing plan, it talks about a ladder of housing opportunity as a goal within the different types of housing that would be available. I think in a similar notion of, if we don't have a lot of types of housing, people are either going to be pushed down and off the ladder, or be forced to reach further on the ladder than maybe they can achieve, or have to hop off the ladder to a surrounding county if they're not able to get high enough from a lower rung to a higher rung. So this is where Charlottesville is called for the same metaphor you're using as we think about this.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because something that is often neglected from the conversation, which I think is important when we consider who this policy should be helping, is what's the cost of living, right? Because we find that many of our families who live at the 60% AMI level and below are often housing burden, meaning that they spend a significant amount of their income, typically over 40% of their income, on housing alone. This puts pressure on other necessities of life, just paying for your children's education or taking care of car notes or buying groceries. All of these things are now made that much more difficult because so much is being spent on housing alone. And so creating this ladder where people, as you said, aren't being pushed to the bottom, are being forced to reach up and pay for something that frankly they can't afford. Just because you can buy something doesn't really mean you can afford it. You know, a lot of people conflate the two, but it's like buying a really expensive car, but you can't pay for the service, can't, pay for the gas. You really can't afford that car. Similarly, you may not be able to afford a home at the upper range of construction in its entirety. You can only barely reach it, but in doing so, you put yourself in financial distress. So lastly, I wanted to just briefly talk about what our approved zoning ordinance looks like. It's a lot of dense materials. I don't want to go through this point by point, but there are some areas I would like to highlight. I think they're important. So out of our range of options, we had the ability to go from duplexes and townhouses all the way up to 8plexes. In Arlington, we settled on 6plexes as our ceiling. So what that means is that we have the ability to build all the way from duplexes and townhouses up to 6plexes. This applies to all of our districts across the county. So in the earlier map I showed you, which was orange, I believe, showing the areas in which affordable housing options would be permitted. This effectively rezones all those areas that had not already been zoned for missing middle. I say that because some neighborhoods in Arlington actually already had missing middle. And I think it's no coincidence that those neighborhoods which had missing middle tended to be those which were traditionally communities of color. So areas like Green Valley or Halls Hill, Arlington Mill, which home primarily our Black and Latino families, were already zoned for missing middle. And most of those neighborhoods I mentioned happen to be in South Arlington. None of the areas that already allow missing middle exist in North Arlington. They're all in South Arlington primarily. So with this reform in our zoning code, we've now extended missing middle to encompass all of Arlington County. We also set an annual cap of 58 permits with a following distribution method, which allows for areas that have higher density to receive less permits, but that with lower density to receive higher amounts of permits, therefore giving a little bit of flexibility and kind of equalizing the playing field in terms of which communities will be absorbing the impact here. So those communities which have traditionally not had a lot of density and have primarily been single family home areas, very few townhouses, very few apartments, will receive more missing middle homes, whereas those which are already somewhat mixed, they already have townhouses, they already have a lot of high rises, they will receive less. So you'll get this more even distribution. There is a sunset cap on this provision within 5 years, which I think was a wise concession to make, but it's done in a way that is not overly onerous. And you can see from the permit amount, which is relatively high, given that our county analysts predicted that you would only be using approximately 24 of those permits per year within the first few years as the market adapts to this new reality, there is no sort of downward pressure being put on the program. Moving over to the next slide, we have tree coverage, which is very important in our conversation in Arlington. For trees, we have units per tree. That was the policy. It was unit per tree. So for 2 to 4 units, there was a requirement of a minimum of 4 shade trees. And for 5 to 6 units, there's requirements of a minimum of 8 shade trees. This was to accommodate concerns that missing middle was going to lead to a degradation of the tree canopy. So I understand in Charlottesville is not so much of a concern. There is a more robust amount of fully grown trees in Charlottesville compared to Arlington. So this might not be as much as a concern, but I just wanted to make a note of it, seeing as it's something that came quite a bit.
It's a big concern from certain quarters in Charlottesville, and at least a concern broadly speaking.
So I do believe that some accommodation is wise, at least to assuage those fears. And I do recognize that the degradation of the tree canopy may lead to a negative outcome where air quality is worsened. So having some sort of accommodation here is, I think, a wise measure. For our minimum site area, for 2 to 4 units, we set minimum site areas the same standards of single detached homes in all districts, which is important because something that stood out throughout our debate was that the minimum site area and our gross floor area, for single family home usage would have been different compared to our missing middle homes, which frankly would have discouraged many home builders from choosing to build missing middle homes, because the thinking is, well, I'm getting paid by how large the house is and how big the gross floor area is, right? I get paid based on that. I don't get paid by unit. So if you're telling me that you're going to have a different set of rules in our construction for missing middle homes versus single family homes, I'm just going to go with the single family homes. That gives me the most money. And so by setting these guidelines in place, we're incentivizing builders to choose to build missing middle homes in addition to building single family homes, which especially in the first few years is really important because this is new. And a lot of these areas, people don't have experience building missing middle homes. They don't exist there. So making sure that we aren't hamstringing efforts to build missing middle homes is vitally important to the long-term effort. What's also important that we have the ability to build ADUs, which, as I stated earlier, can be used for a variety of purposes, not only housing older family members, but also housing younger families. And so here we allow accessory dwelling units only in 2 scenarios, one where interior units within a townhouse or semi-detached home, with an exception of pre-existing ADUs. Lastly, I want to show the list of our partners throughout the process that made this all possible. I think it's extremely important that we had this coalition, because while the strength of any one of our organizations was mighty, by banding together and realizing our common interests, we were able to do what is frankly not common across the United States. I believe the statistics are 71% of zoning fights that occur end with those against reforming zoning code winning. The vast majority of these debates over zoning do not end with the sort of victory that we experience in Arlington. But by having this robust coalition of individuals and organizations from a variety circles. You have advocates within the NAACP, you have Habitat for Humanity, you have Voice, which is a religious coalition organization, you have the Arlington Chamber of Commerce, you even have political organizations like the Arlington Young Democrats, you have housing and family groups like AHC Incorporated, you have even Sierra Club, which there was a very interesting overlap in our interest in not only wanting to have the tree canopy, as I mentioned earlier, be maintained, but also recognizing that missing middle homes are more efficient at using energy, meaning they emit less heat and use less electricity. So you actually have a net decrease in emissions from missing middle homes. So there was common ground there. And I believe finding that common ground was incredibly important to making this victory reality. So with that, I'd like to close and thank you so much for allowing me the time.
Thank you so much, Bryan. That was fantastic. And anyone, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, send them to me. And before we hop into the Q&A, I just want to tie a little bit of this in with Charlottesville. So Charlottesville sort of started a process of downzoning long ago, 100 years ago. And the kind of big event that is loomed in our mind is in 1991. There was a downzoning in the city of about 4,500 parcels that went from allowing various types of missing middle housing to only allowing detached single family homes. Interestingly, at the time, Eugene Williams predicted that doing that would, local civil rights hero and icon Eugene Williams predicted this plan would perpetuate discrimination and make some of these neighborhoods off limits on the basis of race and class. He was pretty prescient when he said that. In Charlottesville, currently a little over 70% of residential land is zoned for detached single family homes only, compared to the 79% in Arlington. And Charlottesville has seen significant displacement of Black residents over the last couple decades as our housing crisis has sort of escalated from a simmer to a boil. So some good questions coming in. Sunshine, why don't you start us off? Is there anything you want to add in terms of providing some local context to what Bryan was talking about?
There we go. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, Bryan, I just want to echo that. I think that was a fantastic presentation. And I think it's really, there's enough commonality between the challenges and underlying reasons for those challenges to exist between Arlington and Charlottesville, and frankly, most small to mid-scale cities. So it was really great. The one phrase that popped to mind as you were going through it is a phrase that I, in my previous work, I've been in Charlottesville for about 5.5 years, but I worked in Austin, Texas prior to that. And a phrase that a local advocate there coined was all kinds of housing for all kinds of people in all kinds of places. Hmm. And fundamentally, that was rooted in one, affordability, but two, sort of like a collective civic context where we are living adjacent to each other, where there is people have access to jobs, to places to live that they can afford, that they can work, and go to the schools they want to go to, et cetera. And I really, that moniker, that phrase has really stuck with me. And I think that it's reflected in what you were talking about. The other thought, and this is not quite local, Matthew, but I was thinking about, as the missing middle conversation was going, I was actually thinking about my mom's house in Portland. And I actually use this example sometimes in Portland, Oregon. She lived in a house in Portland for a number of years on a street in sort of central core Portland. And if it's okay, I just want to kind of share my screen for a second. I just brought up Google Maps just to kind of highlight the what a neighborhood scale missing middle looks like. in a real context. So I'm going to share my screen for 1 second. Can you see that all right? So this is a single family or a neighborhood in Southeast Portland, 15th Street. So it's close in, and you can see 2 homes in front of you. And as I scroll around, you see, and actually, let me say one thing. So in these 2 homes, you have one that's a single family home, the other which is split into 3 apartments by floor. And then you scroll over here and you have a small cottage court at very low scale that provides housing for about, there are small one bedroom and efficiency apartments that provides housing for 8 households right there. And then you turn around the corner and you have a larger, still single family looking scale building, but that has 8 apartments, and you can see it kind of moving towards the back of the lot there. But when I first visited my mom and saw that, it was the first time I had really seen in person an example of how different people living in different contexts, but still having the flavor of a traditional single family neighborhood, it really worked. And that was a common thread throughout some of the neighborhoods there. And I do want to highlight that one of the challenges, again, kind of big picture, that Bryan was referring to, that we struggle with here in Charlottesville, and frankly that everywhere struggles with it throughout the country, is this interplay between historical land use decisions, which resulted in isolated areas of the city segregated from each other, both by race and typology and by wealth, and the sort of macroeconomic policy that has erred on the side of over commodifying housing, because that sits in direct tension with the concept that you had brought up yourself, Bryan, which is housing as a human right. And I think, Matthew, you just brought up made the comment a moment ago that we are now at this boil point. That is true everywhere, and I think we all probably know that the idea of housing as a human right is almost gone in this country. We are at the tipping point. So we have to be looking at how to do a number of things, including, and there's no silver bullet. There's no single solution which is going to address this, but absolutely providing appropriately scaled, increased density in historically exclusionary neighborhoods has to be part of the solution set. And like I said, it's not the only solution. And as one of the things that I noted when I first saw your presentation, Bryan, was the decision to limit the number of permits per year. And when you and I talked before this presentation, one of the things we talked about was that was a way for folks who may have fears about neighborhoods transforming instantly, to recognize that it will take time, fundamentally will take time for things to transition. And my fundamental belief is that even neighborhoods that don't see a lot of physical transition over time are still changing, and they're changing because the cost of housing is rising. So the people who can actually live there change over time, even if the physical infrastructure doesn't. So change is omnipresent, and it's up to us to figure out how we try to provide some guardrails to incentivize change that works for everybody, not just for a few. And the point that you also made that I'm really intrigued by, and I think we are as a city sort of trying to figure this out in our rezoning process, is around how to open up opportunities for modest increased density in historically exclusionary and single family neighborhoods, while not unlocking the floodgates for development pressure on historically Black and lower income neighborhoods, because their land is the least expensive, it is the most undervalued. So that is where development pressure will naturally go if things are not, there's not something to kind of counterbalance that and provide and equalize the pressure to other neighborhoods. In our city's case, and if for those who are on the call, and are aware of the rezoning documents that have been released, Module 1 was released a month and a half or 2 months ago. Module 2 was released recently. In tandem with Module 2 was a document called Sensitive Community Area Overview. And that idea of providing a bit of a protective overlay over historically Black and or lower income neighborhoods to try to equalize the pressure about where development is going to happen. That's one mechanism for potentially doing that. And the document that is released by the city identifies pros and cons, trade-offs with that, because there's no simple solution which addresses every single concern. The point that one idea that I think I heard you say, Brian, I'd actually like to hear a little clarification on this. I think you said that in this limitation of number of permits, that in the neighborhoods that have not received development recently, that the number of permits is higher there relative to the other areas. Is that right? Can you talk about that?
Yes, that's correct. And I think it kind of goes to address that concern you're having as well, or that rather that's concern that's present in Charlottesville as well, which is that we don't want to lead to a gentrification of certain neighborhoods by allowing for a sort of unfettered access to communities which have lower land values. And so, yes, in addition to the annual cap that's been set about 58 units, we also have a distribution model. And that distribution model is such that, and I can pull up the numbers for you in a second. Yeah. So in those districts which have larger lots and typically are more sparse in the amount of homes they have, typically are single family homes, don't have a lot of mixed use, meaning that much of that land is frankly overvalued by the sheer fact that there isn't the sort of diversity in homes there. You're talking, in Arlington's case, it's the R6, R8, R10. That just means that these districts have a certain zoning restriction put upon them. Those areas have a distribution method of 21 permits for R8, R10, R20 districts, and 30 permits for R6s, whereas there's only 7 permits in the R5 districts. R5s typically are the areas that accommodate more townhouses and usually some mid to high-rise apartments. So you see that those areas that have usually higher land value get more permits. Those that have lower land value, they get less, demonstrably, right? Going from 21 to 30 in some instances to 7. So I think that was a very important consideration that the NAACP was pushing for, so that we wouldn't have the sort of rush on cheaper land.
And Brian, to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, can you say the population of Arlington? I just want to compare that to Charlottesville as well, as we think about that.
So it's approximately 240,000.
So with 240,000 people compared to Charlottesville, roughly 50,000 people. So roughly 5 times the size. And the number of permits that are capped per year is at 58, if I have the number right.
That's right.
Can you talk about how that number came out? And the reason I'm highlighting that in particular is that there is the folks who have expressed, at least what I've heard, expressed the most fear around the idea of increasing density in single family neighborhoods in Charlottesville, have this fear that by making the zoning change, that all of a sudden within a very short period of time, their neighborhoods are going to just dramatically change. And I know the Charlottesville Planning Commission and the consultants have done their own analyses around what their expected rate of change might be. But I'm curious to hear how the analysis came about in a city 5 times the size.
Yeah, so I believe the process was fairly similar. So our county staff and consultants over a period of several years were basically given free rein to look at what Arlington could responsibly maintain, right? Not to max out land usage, but could responsibly maintain, considering a number of external factors like the environment and transportation. And what they came up with was a number of approximately 24 permits. 24 permits would be utilized within the first 2 to 3 years. That was their expectation. So the cap number, which sits at 58, is over double that amount, obviously. So that was done both as a political compromise, but also as a way of setting the cap so high that it would not reasonably impede the development of missing middle homes in the first few years. Something that we feared coming into this process as the plan began to take more form was that a cap, if imposed, was going to be particularly low and sit either underneath or right above the amount of units predicted by our analysts. And so with a number like 58, it does both jobs fairly well, right? It assuages the fears of those in the community who worry about runaway development, where at the same time, not signaling to home builders that it's unsafe to build in this market.
That was really helpful, Brian. Thanks.
I'm curious, Brian. So one of the critiques I've heard of the cap is that, at least as of when this was approved, and maybe this is being ironed out, that developers will be left uncertain whether or not they'll be able to access one of the permits to build missing middle housing. And so in the interest of minimizing their risk, they're either going to avoid building altogether or just build the McMansion that they're allowed to build by right, which I think this would be a similar dynamic potentially in Charlottesville, because you can build the McMansion or some version of that, but you might find yourself feeling like you either don't trust the city government, municipal government, or the process is too convoluted or indirect. So are there any things in the works to kind of mitigate some of those concerns?
Well, I think two things are important to recognize. The first is that given that this policy is relatively new, the expectation that you're going to get a swarm of developers jumping on this, I think, is not realistic. And according to our district breakdown, you see that the larger amounts of permits, which could accommodate, given the dimension, so the R in the R district refers to the square footage, the land, how much you can actually put on the lots. Those areas would accommodate mostly duplexes up to some quads and the occasional sixplex. And the areas where you wouldn't have much space to be able to accommodate a sixplex, or if we had the ability to accommodate an eightplex, you have less room for those. And logically, you have less permits for those, given that there's less space. In those instances, those houses, which could reasonably be put on a land profile that is generally in line with the rest of the community, I don't believe personally would, I'm thinking of kind of like a lot of the counterfactuals, but I don't think that there'll be an issue with putting, or the amount of permits that are allowed under the 5-year cap plan would not disincentivize builders from building duplexes up to sixplexes with the current amount of permits given the R district distribution. I think it would be different if you had a situation where the profile of the buildings would be different versus your single family. But what I think it's important to recognize is that the land profile that a single family home could accommodate is the same land profile that any missing middle home could accommodate. there's no discrepancy there. And I think what also helps address this incentivizes builders to build missing middle apartments or buildings rather, is the fact that the rules on your maximum lot coverage and your minimum site area, your gross floor area are basically one-to-one between your missing middle homes as well as your single family homes. So there's not a huge price differential in terms of how much money you could make building, let's say, quad versus single family home. If that wasn't true, then I would be more worried.
That makes sense. I think what's currently proposed in Charlottesville is allowing slightly larger lot coverage for some of the missing middle types, but it's not a dramatic difference. I think in some cases we're talking the difference between 55% up to, I think, a max of 70% at the largest, but it's 60, 65, it's incremental. Thank you. That's very helpful. This is really helping me think about this question of a cap, because I have a feeling this is going to be imported to Charlottesville in some form.
I'm sorry for not giving a completely clear answer. It's a little bit, there was a lot around that conversation in Arlington as well. And so I'm kind of going over some of the logic that the NAACP and some of our allies had when we were arguing that, because it is a controversial point. But I think at the end of it, we realized that the cap isn't as scary as it sounds if certain things are true, right? If the cap is set high enough, if the amount of permits far exceeds the amount predicted in the first few years by our consultants, and if the distribution of units is such that you don't have the sort of run on low cost land. Given those things, I think there is in addition to the points I made earlier about the minimum lot sizes, site areas, and the gross floor areas. Given that those things are true, we didn't anticipate to be any significant issues.
Gotcha. Great. Sunshine, this is a question for you. I mean, Bryan, you might have some thoughts on this, but Sunshine, will end up the Charlottesville specific version, I think would be helpful. So what are your thoughts on basically how missing middle housing can enable Charlottesville to have more housing at 60% AMI, 50% AMI, 30% AMI, area median income? So basically, how can these housing types be beneficial to lower income and working class people in Charlottesville? What are some things, kind of the limits, but also the opportunities?
So this is one of the challenges is that zoning in and of itself is a part of the tool set, and it's sort of fundamental, but in and of itself won't necessarily achieve affordability without additional measures. And so it's an interplay. You need the zoning in place. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient on its own.
And I think that's been maybe a little bit of a misunderstanding of certain people's critiques of the Seville plans process, which is that this is just about zoning to create affordability. But if you look at the affordable housing plan, it's clearly stated that zoning is a piece of the puzzle, but other mechanisms are critical to that. So I just want to highlight that.
Yep, that zoning is necessary but wholly insufficient on its own. And I do want to highlight here that housing that is affordable to people at, say, 50 or 60% AMI, and certainly below that, but even at 60, and frankly at this stage in the game, even up to 80%, is almost impossible to build without some form of subsidy. And there are different flavors of what that subsidy can look like. In the case of, you know, a multifamily building that's supported by low-income housing tax credits and city funding, that's one form of subsidy where you're doing You're embedding an subsidy directly into the construction to reduce the cost of it, so you have less debt on the property, so you can have lower rents. That's so that's just money. Frankly, that's just money. Another form of subsidy is by changing the dynamic between the price of land and how much building or units you can build. And it's still driven by the market in many ways if you don't have additional sort of dollar subsidies in there. But the part of the point of increasing the number of units you can build on a single parcel is that, you know, building let's just say 3,000 square feet of home on a lot that costs $250,000, it means it has to be unaffordable to most folks in the city. That same parcel of land at the same value split now between 3 or 4 homes, you know, in a 3,000 square foot envelope, necessarily means those are lower, they're lower cost to build, and to some extent that will be translated on to the final cost, whether through rent or sale. Now, there's not one of the challenges we face, and I say we in the macro sense as a country, and I sort of put this in the chat as Bryan was talking, is that we are so far behind on the supply curve that, and the cost of land is so high, it is difficult to not do higher end housing, even in that context, because the demand is still in that upper level anyway. So, but nonetheless, if you don't have the ability to build more units on a single site, it will perpetuate and exacerbate the affordability condition in perpetuity. We have to be able to do that. And then the last piece is, you know, there are part of the zoning that we are proposing in the city, and that it's currently in its draft form, as everyone knows, is opportunities for doing getting additional density if you're doing affordable housing. And one of the questions I think it's still unresolved in this consultant's analysis and the staff's position, and frankly in the advocate's position too, is whether if you go, like, let's say you go from having up to 3 units per lot and you double that if you're going to do affordable housing, do you necessarily need all 6 of those units to be affordable in order to achieve that extra, get that extra density? Or can you intermix some market rate and some affordable with the idea that you're doing some cross subsidy? Again, you're gaining efficiency on the cost of land relative to the cost of construction. And that provides an informal way of bringing some subsidy into a project. And that's probably one of the ways that is most realistic as we look to the next few years. And I see Bryan just came unmuted, because I'm sure you have a comment on that too, Lynn Arlington.
Yeah, so just something to kind of tag on to that. So for our maximum lot coverage standards, missing middle homes effectively would have an identical base lot coverage standard compared to single detached homes. But in the case of missing middle homes, we also provide additional allowed coverage, even if a detached garage isn't built. So that's one of these incentives to have people build missing middle homes, and I think address a prevalent issue around parking, which has come up a lot of times in our conversations. And I, for one, am someone who believes that street parking, frankly, should be sufficient, and that people, when we are discussing issues of housing, should not be entitled to have a parking lot where someone could live. And we are effectively treating parking lots, or rather driveways, as equivalent to someone's housing needs. I think that is misguided. And so I think putting in place this standard by which we allow for additional lot coverage, even if a detached garage isn't built, incentivizes developers to build larger missing middle homes, because they now know that they can use that space that would have gone to a garage and instead build a few more units. So we're incentivizing density that way.
So in Charlottesville, in the current proposed draft is saying there will not be parking requirements for essentially all except for some very large projects, there'd need to be a parking plan, which is a position that Livable Seville has supported strongly, because we believe that parking mandates end up causing a variety of affordability issues, environmental issues, and make it harder to do creative reuse of land. Sunshine, I guess I'm going to do one more question for you. Could you just highlight how zoning, thinking of the Friendship Court project, stacked townhouses are part of that project. Could you talk just a little bit, because my understanding is that they're actually currently not proposed to be allowed in a lot of Charlottesville. Talk a little bit about some of the housing types that will be in the Friendship Court redevelopment and how those unlocked some different types of affordability.
So as you pointed out, let me back up for a minute. So the residents at Friendship Court currently live mostly in what are equivalent to townhouses now. They're in some cases they're a unit over a unit, but in most cases they're a two-story unit that they walk into and it's next to each other. And that's what the residents of Friendship Court know, and that's the way they engage with their surrounding neighborhood. So when we were working with the residents on the redesign and redevelopment, they had to make some trade-off decisions, because all these decisions were in their hands. And some of the trade-off decisions were, they knew that they wanted to provide additional affordable housing at different income tiers in the redevelopment process. They knew that. But when we did our initial studies, if you did that all as townhomes, we wouldn't get there. Like, we'd only add a very modest level, and it wouldn't really change a whole lot in terms of additional capacity on the site. On the other hand, we did the kind of opposite end, which is, okay, well, what if we did all multifamily apartment style? And that was not a typology that everyone wanted to live in. Some people did. Some people were excited about that idea, but not everyone. And we also knew that if we did all mid-rise multifamily apartments, we'd also have a parking challenge, frankly, because where this tension between what parking actual demand is relative to what we can provide, doing surface parking versus structured parking, which is 5 to 7 times more expensive, prioritizing open space for kids to play, all those things, all those trade-offs we had to work through. And ultimately, the residents landed on the idea of a balance between townhomes and multifamily buildings, trying to find that thread that needle between the right densities, parking needs, and open space needs. And the one way to get the density we wanted, but to maintain that townhome typology, which is to do what's called a 2/2. And that idea came actually from Northern Virginia, where we had brought the advisory committee, the residents from Friendship Court, up to Northern Virginia to tour a few different projects up there to see what was possible, to see what was built in those communities. And we saw some older townhome communities, we saw some multifamily building communities, we saw some sitting side by side. And it was that experience of being exposed to alternative forms that let them feel comfortable with the typology we landed on. And the 2/2s are, like I said, are much more common in Northern Virginia. Really, I think we might be doing the first 2/2s in the city of Charlottesville, or maybe one of the first anyway. I think it's going to become a more common methodology, because it does get some additional density by still maintaining that sort of traditional single family style form. And to your point that it looks like it's not really allowed in RA, B, and C right now because of height limits. The Housing Advisory Committee met actually today, and one of the recommendations we're going to make to the consultants is to allow for up to 4 stories in RA, B, and C if you're doing multi-unit buildings. So if you are doing a 2/2 townhome, or you're doing stacked apartments, so, the typical missing middle type of housing forms that you allow for up to 4 stories. Yes, it'll still have that same feel of the single family neighborhood. It'll be scaled at that level, but it allows for multi-unit developments. And so the Housing Advisory Committee is going to make that strong recommendation.
Wonderful. I think that, just hearing that story makes me think about, we've experimented with low density restrictive zoning And up until we've experimented with that for about 30 years. And we, up until about 5 years ago, weren't really subsidizing housing in any substantive ways. And that has not worked well for Charlottesville. And I think that one of the things that's exciting to me about this process is that this is going to provide us opportunities if we have the flexibility with zoning, if we have the funding support continue, that we're going to learn what works and what doesn't work. Because I think we know pretty clearly what doesn't work, but it is going to be a process. Like, would we know that stacked townhomes can work if Friendship Court wasn't being redeveloped? You know, I think that provides us with really helpful information. We're going to wrap up there. We could talk all night long, but before we go, I always try to end with something practical. And the ask is that if you would, I just put a Google Doc in the chat to everyone. The city is taking feedback on modules 1 and 2 until the end of April. And we need pro-housing voices to offer their support and feedback on the zoning code. The folks who do not want multifamily missing middle homes in their neighborhoods are going to speak up. And those of us from Livable Seville's perspective, those of us who would like to see more of those housing types and more opportunity in more neighborhoods, we need to do things like email about technical zoning stuff. So the Google Doc I just put in provides a sample letter. We're going to be kind of making this into some different forms over the next few days, but really would appreciate if folks can provide feedback on this. It's going to be very important. But Sunshine and Bryan, thank you so much. That was excellent. I really, really appreciate your time, and you're really helping our community elevate its conversations around these critical issues. Thank you so much.
And Matthew, just one quick thing. I did have one question come to me about the sharing of that slide deck. Is that, Bryan, are you okay sharing that? And then Matthew can send that out?
I believe so. I can just reach out to other individual, help me craft this and just get their approval, but I don't think there should be any issues.
Okay, and we can, we'll send that out in, if that's allowed, we'll put it on social media and in our newsletter that goes out at the end of the month.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
No, thank you. Have a great day.